Welcome back to part 2 of our investigation into the Ford Firestone controversy. If you haven't seen part 1, check it out here. Let's get straight back into things. What was causing such a staggering number of fatalities associated with Firestone ATX tires and Ford Explorers? First, let's talk about Ford. There's some evidence that Ford was aware of a tire defect. For example, they did issue recalls in overseas countries in 1998, 99, and 2000. But the bulk of the complaints went straight to Firestone or NHTSA, so Ford can't really be blamed for misinterpreting the severity of the problem. Remember how the Explorer was essentially an SUV body sitting on a Ford Ranger chassis? Well, this is where the problem, in some people's opinions, originates. The Ranger is a truck. Although most drivers don't regularly use pickups for transporting heavy machinery, tools, supplies, and so on, they're built to handle these things regardless. As such, the Ranger and the Ford Explorer had twin I-beam suspension at the front instead of the live axle found on competitor SUVs. This heavy-duty suspension was supposed to make the ride more stable on highways, not necessarily smoother. However, it had a drawback. Because the suspension arms were more fixed in place, going over any kind of bump would upset the front wheel's camber. We love how Car Throttle sums it up. Quote, "I feel confident that a drunken giraffe could handle a set of corners more confidently." End quote. However, the problems actually primarily affected the second generation models. This is because Ford upgraded the suspension to improve fuel economy but didn't lower the engine, creating an even more top-heavy car. As a result, when a tire blew, the car was even more likely to roll. And in Ford's initial tests, roll it did. This gave Ford engineers several options. Ultimately, they decided to reduce the tire pressure to 26 psi, far lower than the 35 psi used in most comparative Ranger models. This would better spread the car's weight and make it more stable, but it was left more prone to wear and overheating. Remember that comment from the Car and Driver review? It was made innocently, but the reviewer inadvertently foreshadowed part of the future problem way back in 1991. Some attribute this high weight distribution as the reason for excessive cases of rollover in Explorers, but there's one thing worth mentioning here. Later tests would discover that the Ford Explorer wasn't particularly more or less likely to roll over than competitor SUVs running the same tires. The tires, therefore, were what made the difference. That doesn't let Ford off the hook though. Firestone and Ford worked hand in hand on vehicle development. Each was responsible for performance in the finished vehicle. So the Explorer was relatively comfy for an SUV, which isn't really saying much for that period. However, its stability and tire integrity left some things to be desired. In 2002, Ford released the third generation Explorer. It was lower and wider and came with electronic stability control and tires at a more standard pressure of 30 psi. No surprise there. Firestone received reports of tread separation on the same tire on the same car for years and chose to do nothing. They didn't notify NHTSA, and it seems they had little collaboration with even Ford. Firestone investigations initially concluded that the tires weren't being used in appropriate settings. This may have been true in many cases. Still, unlike the state vehicles in Arizona, Firestone never offered to upgrade the tires on new or existing Ford vehicles. This lack of moral integrity is why the problem was allowed to go on for so long. There's no way past this. Firestone must bear the brunt of the blame. However, you should know a few noteworthy things. The ATX2 tires were to blame for many tread separation accidents. The standard ATX tires were designed in the 80s for Ford SUVs and light trucks, but Ford asked Firestone to redevelop them specifically for the Explorer. The ATX2 would be more lightweight to improve the poor fuel economy stemming from Ford's use of low tire pressures in the Explorer. Both parties benefited. Ford could say the Explorer guzzled less gas, well, slightly, and Firestone could produce the same tire for less since it required less material. It was in the best interest of both parties to continue using this tire wherever possible. An April 2012 NHTSA statistics report revealed the following. According to a 2003 NHTSA report, an estimated 414 fatalities, 10,275 non-fatal injuries, and 78,392 crashes occurred annually due to flat tires or blowouts before tire pressure monitoring systems were installed in vehicles. Tire blowouts happen all the time, and sadly drivers sometimes perish in those accidents. However, the incidents involving Firestone tires on Ford Explorers in the 1990s far exceed the expected number of fatalities per vehicle. In many of the Firestone cases from this period, owners hadn't maintained their tire pressures. A driver usually gets away with this since manufacturers typically recommend keeping tires at a higher PSI, usually 35 PSI or higher in an SUV. However, since Ford decided the Firestone tires should be 26 PSI, any standard drop in air pressure would be incrementally more dangerous. This doesn't exonerate Firestone, but it's information worth knowing. At the end of such a messy scandal involving hundreds of deaths, Ford and Firestone went their separate ways. A partnership that had lasted almost a century went up in a puff of smoke, with each side blaming the other. Ford fired the first shot, accusing Firestone of withholding tire data. Firestone and Bridgestone quickly responded by pointing the finger back at the automaker, declaring they hadn't designed the Explorer to meet tire safety standards. Firestone was forced to close the source of the defective tires, its factory in Decatur, Illinois, with 1,500 employees laid off. Ford issued additional tire recalls out of its own pocket, expanding the scope from those published by Firestone. All the while, the blame game continued furiously. The government and private attorneys rubbed their hands with glee as Ford and Firestone traded blows. With the old friends turning on each other, both would undermine their defenses and both would receive a portion of the blame. However, Ford came out of the scandal less scathed than Firestone and its parent Bridgestone, which saw its market value half. The fallout was massive. The two companies formally split ways on May 21, 2001, ending their supplier partnership after almost 100 years. Chairmen, CEOs, and leaders on both sides would resign. The controversy has been estimated to have cost Firestone and Ford billions of dollars in recall costs, lost revenue, and lost market value. And of course, it had led to the needless deaths of so many. Let's end such a disheartening case with a positive. The Ford-Firestone scandal led to the TREAD Act, the Transportation Recall Enhancement Accountability and Documentation Act, being signed into law in November 2000. This law forces car makers to report recalls in foreign countries to NHTSA and makes it a criminal offense to not report defects to NHTSA in a timely fashion. The widespread prevalence of tire pressure monitor systems, or TPMs, can also be traced back to these incidents. And a heartwarming turn of events came to pass at Ford. William Clay Ford Jr. became Ford's CEO on October 30, 2001, after the previous CEO, Jacques Nasser, was ousted, partly due to his handling of the scandal. He remained in this position until 2006, when he took on the role of Ford's executive chairman. William Clay Ford Jr. was Henry Ford's great-grandson. He was also the great-grandson on his mother's side of Harvey S. Firestone. And so, although the companies have parted ways, the friendship between these two men lives on in him and his family. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. Let us know in the comments which automotive scandal you want covered next time and if you were affected by the Ford-Firestone controversy.